I'm Jonathan Rose, the co-founder of the Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Ibrahim Abdul-Matin. Ibrahim Abdul-Matin is an urban strategist whose work focuses on deepening democracy, something we certainly need today, and improving public engagement, something else we need today. He's advised 2 mayors on the best way to translate complex decisions into costs, impacts, and benefits of environmental policies and their impact on communities. He's the founder of Green Squash Consulting, a management consulting firm based in New York that works with people, organizations, companies, and coalitions and governments committed to equality and justice. And he's the author of The Green Deen, What Islam Teaches Us About Protecting the Planet. He sits on the New York Advisory Board of the Trust for Public Land, as well as the International Living Future Institute, which encourages the creation of regenerative built environment, and Sapelo Square, whose mission is to celebrate, analyze the experiences of Black Muslims in the United States. So we are so delighted, Ibrahim, that you can join us. And the format for our listeners is that we'll be on this call for about an hour today. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get towards as many of them as we can towards the end of the conversation. And also, if you monitor the chat box, folks, so for example, in the chat box right now, you can see how to buy Ibrahim's book and a link to the future video, a recording of this. And so kind of information in the chat box, questions and answers in the Q&A box, and we are ready to go. So Ibrahim, you were born in Brooklyn, and it was probably a different Brooklyn at that time. So do you have memories of your childhood there?
That's a great question. Wow. That's great. So the first, Jonathan, nice to be here, and I'm just honored to be on with whoever is here, and whoever's listening, paying attention. Bless you. You could be doing lots of other things with your time. So that's a great question. One of my favorite memories, we used to live around the corner. If any of you guys remember that hip hop song, I Got It Made, which is a old standard, that it was actually filmed right on the corner of Prospect Park.
Right.
And I used to live right around the corner of Prospect Park on St. John's, between Washington and Underhill.
Right.
And in that time, it was like a whole different universe. I mean, it was a whole different planet. On the corner, there was a big, huge building that's now a very lovely, I'm sure it's very co-ops or something that's very lovely.
Expensive.
What's that?
And expensive.
Probably very expensive. Wonderful layouts, probably tall ceilings, nice molding, everything that you'd like. But back then it was completely bombed out and burned out, and they had no running water. And the people would come downstairs to fill up their water from the hydrant on the street. And that was like a known thing in that neighborhood. And across the street diagonal, there were folks that were, I mean, it was people dealing drugs on the corner, and it was people that would have shootouts in the alleyway in the back. And we just knew that. My mom she used to do that classic thing. Her name is Abdul-Matin. She's now an interfaith, an ordained minister. And she would walk us down and do that classic thing where she said to the guys on the corner, if you see my sons get involved with you, you're going to have to deal with me. But the best memory, like when you just said that, the thing that jumped out of my head is that when I was around 9, my mother said that I could go only a few places by myself. And one of those places that I could go only by myself was to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden.
Right.
And the Brooklyn Botanic Garden was this magical place for me. This absolutely magical place. I would go to the Cherry Esplanade. Me and my brother would like pack a bag. We'd put some stuff in it, some chips or whatever, some now and laters. And we'd bring our comic books, and we'd fall asleep in the Cherry Esplanade. And more than once, many times, we were like shook awake by the guards at the garden saying it's time to go home. That was our little oasis. I remember I used to go there and take off our shoes and walk around barefoot. And this is like, in the heart of crack era. And this was our little wonderful oasis. That, and the other one was the Brooklyn Museum. I used to just wander around the halls of the Brooklyn Museum and just looking at everything and everything until they closed it. So I have, the idea of Brooklyn to me was a place that was without lawless really,
Right.
and free to a certain extent. And also you could create yourself. Like you weren't bound by anything. And also you weren't afraid necessarily. Like we didn't feel fear the same way
Right.
that people fear now. It was a different type of fear. And since we didn't do anything, we weren't involved in things.
Right.
It was, the part of that excitement was staying above that fear a little bit.
Hmm. That's fantastic. And just for those who are listening who don't know, that's a pretty Tony area of Brooklyn right now. I think Chuck Schumer lives there.
Yeah, he lives around the corner.
Exactly. And so anyway, it's dramatically improved. And actually, I want to talk to you about neighborhood improvement and the role of Muslims in neighborhood improvement, because there's been a cycle that has been long recognized that you have difficult neighborhoods, and first the artists move in because it's cheap, and gay people move in. In the old days, the theory was because they didn't have kids to send to school, but that's not true anymore. So the school district didn't matter for them so much. Um, and then there's this cycle by which neighborhoods got gentrified, and in that gentrification process, if it was super successful, as it was where you grew up, then the original people who lived there got priced out and no longer felt part of it. Now, what's interesting is as the great waves of Muslim migration came to the United States, particularly in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and moved to places like Detroit, they actually stabilized neighborhoods, invested in neighborhoods. They became the guys who were running the bodegas and the small businesses, but in a way that supported the local community versus, in effect, gentrified the local communities.
I thought, as when I used to play, I lived upstate also, and I played football growing up. And I played, before you would pray in most American schools, before you play a game, you recite the Christian Lord's Prayer.
Huh.
And everyone sits around and they know it by heart. And maybe not today, but I'm sure there's still plenty of schools and plenty of places where that is a standard practice. And we heard about folks in Dearborn, Michigan that were reciting the Fatiha, which is the opening prayer of the Quran. And I just remember just feeling a huge swell of pride, because the way that I played back then was, very much like I was a very reverent, very focused, very prayerful. And that's how I approached the game. And to think that there was enough of a community, right? Now, then to fast forward, maybe, many years later or whatever, 13, 14 years later, after that time period, I remember walking around actually with Rashida Tlaib, who's now the representative from Michigan, walking around in parts of Michigan that were primarily Arab and Muslim areas. And it was just beautiful and astonishing. And the idea that a place could be forgotten and abandoned and left alone, and that people can come in and help revitalize it, is not old in human history. This is what we do. We shift, we move around. It's only, I think, been in our time frame where we think, I have to stay exactly where I'm at, like, in a more modern like now. But I think that there's something to be said because underlying what you're saying is that even just neighborhoods, not just neighborhoods, but whole communities, like we could revitalize lots of places in the United States if we were more open-minded about who would move there. A lot of folks, like Muslim communities, will stay in an urban area or stay close to an urban area. And particularly the folks that immigrated from other countries, because they can get to airports quickly, they can do that sort of thing. But there's so much opportunity and so much value in spreading that out. This idea of like density as being almost orthodox.
Right.
And that there's a pushback against that. And I think that what you're speaking to is a little bit about that there is a need for more open-mindedness in spaces that aren't as dense, so that we can have much more dynamic places and we can regenerate and revitalize them.
Right. So let's talk about this idea of regeneration. So, I'm so impressed that you're on the board of the International Living Future Institute. I want to talk about their view of regeneration and your view of regeneration. Before we do, why don't you tell people what it is?
Living Future Institute really looks at the built environment and really tries to transform how we think about the built environment. to make sure that buildings are not taking away from our planet, and also and sort of helping regenerate and heal, and transform the way that we live on the planet. So the living building standards, people have heard of LEED building standards. So these are just standards by which people who are going to build something will build. And one of the basic ideas, the one that jumps out to me about it, is that you should not be carving up land that has not been developed yet. That we have lots of spaces where people can be. We should be figuring out how to manage those spaces better and use the resources that we have on site in ways that we haven't even imagined doing. So in some ways we can transform even not just the building, but the space around it, and how, but most importantly, how human beings relate to that space. So that's one big part of the Living Future Institute, the Living Building Challenge. It challenges developers and builders and architects to really rethink how they build. The other layer of it is around living products, around products that are free from poisons and carcinogens and things that come from the extractive economy, like oil, things that come out of the ground, and what I call in Green Dean, energy from hell, things that are, we pull out of the ground versus energy from heaven, like wind and solar and that sort of thing. And what's beautiful about that is that you can start, it's a framework really for people to make decisions that are the right decision, even if they're not the people that are like the standard bearers, right? You don't have to be the obsessed with sustainability. If you have a big warehouse and you need to put drapes or carpet into it, you can make a good decision to do that, and not even really care, and one that might be best for the environment and also good for your bottom line. And that's what Living Future Institute is striving for us to really create a massive level scale change. I think it's going to be really crucial for the Green New Deal also. When we start to think about how do we execute the Green New Deal, it's really, to me, a blueprint for how we can execute the Green New Deal.
So the Living Building Challenge, which is kind of the guideline of the International Living Building Future Institute, excuse me, says, what if every single act of design and construction made the world a better place?
Yeah.
And that's so interesting because so much of our current Western way of building degrades the world. And most people aren't knowledgeable or intentional about it. I mean, it's not like people are setting out to degrade the world. It's really the larger system and the framework in which you get your stuff. I remember when I did my very, very first building, renovated in 1979, and I went to the local lumber store and I said, I want lumber that, didn't come from raping the rainforest. And they go, that lumber comes from the wholesaler. I don't know where it comes from. Like that idea was, the system was not set up to answer that question. Today, the system is set up to answer that question. It's marginal, and what it really takes is attention. So, I mean, if you just follow the normal way of doing things, we're not going to make the world a better place with every act. But with intentionality, we can. And that's what I love actually about your 6 principles. And that's what I want to dive into now, is the intentionality behind them, because they give a way of seeing the world and thinking about the world that is both spiritual and ethical, that then frames our action.
Yeah, that's great. I the way that you talked about that really just struck to me around the way that I've seen the reason why I was attracted to an organization that like Living Future Institute is, how do you find organizations that reflect your values but may not even intentionally do it? Some of the most wonderful coincidences. So I wrote Green Dean, and part of the challenge of it was trying to organize, there's lots of scholarship and theological thought and writings and very sophisticated jurisprudence. There's even a developing fiqh al-bayah, which is basically the jurisprudence of the environment, which is sort of coming out of the brother Imam Safed Katovic and Nana Furman and other folks with the Green Muslims that are very intentional about taking a deep look at not only the Quran, which is the revealed sources, which comes from direct, in the Islamic context, we understand that it's the word of God that he revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, but also his actions, the Prophet's actions, and what he did, what he said, That's the hadith, which is
Right.
another important source. A group has actually put together 40 green hadith, which is a really important contribution. And I've been really thinking a lot about, what we've all been thinking, what are the underpinnings for some of this, from a philosophical and religious and ethical perspective, what are some of the underpinnings? They focus on water and earth and plants and animals, just like I do in Green Dean. They organize it a little bit different. But one of the things that's completely universal whenever anyone talks about environmental issues and Islam, they cover some of these main areas. We talk initially about the idea of Tawheed, which is the oneness of God and oneness of creation, meaning that this is the example that I love to give. And I just the other day, I went to the top of Bear Mountain, which isn't like it's very strenuous, it's very steep, but the vista is really beautiful. You get lovely rolling hills, rolling mountains, baby mountains in New York State. And you see this amazing view and it stretches out. And if you get up high enough, you start to see the brown and white in front of you. And then beyond that, the sort of blue as it bends around and twists into the distance. And that really just struck me, as always it does. You lose your breath just for a moment. And that kind of losing of your breath is one of the moments that I always describe as you realizing, and your initial thought is like, wow, look what God has created. Look what the creator has done. But really, in some ways, it's just you realizing what you are actually part of, that you are connected to that thing, and you are seeing that reflection of yourself in this really astonishing way. And that losing your breath is just absolutely intrinsically part of that realization. You cannot deny it anymore in that particular moment. So that sense of Tawheed is that you and it are also created. There is a creator. And that's a really important thing within an Islamic context. If we talk about Islam and science, we talk about Islam and technology, we talk about Islam and development and how to manage lands and how to manage natural resources. It always comes back to this root of Tawheed, of the fact that there's one creator and that it's in that relationship. So within that context, we see out into that of Tawheed, we see into nature, we see the signs of God, ayat, everywhere. Ayats are just, we speak about ayats as being the signs of God, or actually the ayats in the Quran, which are sections of the Quran that you read and recite, the Revelation, but it's also what's in nature. And one of the good brothers, Muhammad Shakaki, who I believe is on here, so respect to you, Muhammad, he reminded me, and I think it was something Sayyid Hussein Nasser had said, who was a scholar from Georgetown, Persian scholar, who wrote Man and Nature. And that was one of the initial books from a Muslim perspective, came out around the time of Silent Spring and in the 50s and 60s. And just that when you're in nature, when you're in the woods, when you're in the natural world, you're seeing the ayats of God everywhere. You're in that. So you're almost reading and walking in a Quran. So the natural world is a walking Quran. There's this place out in Grafton Lake, upstate New York, that me and my dad, we hike out to, and then we find this little clearing that he's established because he hikes there regularly. We particularly go there when it's snowy, when we have to wear snowshoes and all our gear. And that is what we call that's our masjid when we go there. It's our sacred space in that space, and we've identified it as that. And those trees, in Islam, we say those trees and the leaves and everything will be part of your record. They are recording of what we're doing. We think we're always taking selfies and everything. Well, everything around us is constantly being recorded for our actions, and they will speak on our behalf or against us. So the things that we've destroyed, the ayats that we've destroyed in nature, the blade of grass, the thing that you stamped on, the thing that you destroyed or burned, an ant hill that you maybe got destroyed because the ant bit you. All those things are going to speak for you and against you. You as a human being are a steward or a khalifa of the earth. And that means there's a trust. The movie Soul that just came out, I don't know if you got the chance to see it, the Disney movie, it's quite lovely. And one of the ideas that it conveys in that movie is around the idea of the human soul as existing before it comes here as a state of just pure light. And our soul, before we come here, we are told basic information, and we understand that information, and then we're sent into our body and we don't remember any of it. And at some point, so our soul is this timeless thing. We are given that information about that relationship between us and the earth in that conversation. So when we come here, we actually know what is right. So sometimes I tell people, you actually know. You don't have to search There's no deep searching for knowledge or truth. I mean, for the truth, there's search for knowledge, but truth, we know truth. We can feel truth. And part of that is that this is our home. This is our earth. You know, the idea of us gestating in our mothers for 9 months, and then we go back into the earth, and then we decompose. These are all beautiful processes that show our relationship to this natural world around us. That Khalifa, we have this amana, and then the final two, I pause there just because within the context of this earth, there's this notion of scarcity that really dominates our modern way of thinking. That there's not enough water, that there's not enough food, that there's not enough housing, there's not enough air, clean air. And frankly, there's not enough love. And because there's not enough, that somebody here, somebody in the world is going to have to go hungry. Someone's going to have to go without. Not everyone's going to get love. Someone's going to have to be treated badly. It's not going to be me. This whole idea of scarcity really, really is, it shows you that we are out of balance. In Islam, we talk about mizan, or this balance, and maintaining the balance. That's justice, that's adl. That sense of justice is when we understand that there's enough here for everybody. There is literally enough here on the earth for everyone. We have to manage this better. And that really gets to the root cause that kind of bounces you back to the idea of Tawheed, that says that when I first wrote Green Dean, it was really just sort of this service level. But this pandemic and this particular moment that we're having has really jumped in my mind, this idea of us as the gardener. That we are not only something that can hurt or cause harm or cause damage on the planet, that we have to be actively involved in helping to cultivate all sorts of goodness on the planet. And that just opens up an array of things that we can do instead of being this disempowered and inherently destructive entity, which is part of the colonial project. The colonial project basically went in and extracted people, extracted things out of the ground, burned down places, destroyed entire civilizations, destroyed languages. And that whole project, the whole goal was to separate us from the understanding of our relationship to the natural world. That's the part that we can re-heal and repair. And as I think we need to rethink of ourselves. We are the gardeners of the planet Earth. We have a responsibility to till the soil, to rotate the crops, to make sure the animals get their due. These are the things that are running through my head.
Wow, that's a lot. And I want to dig into.
Sorry.
No. It's fantastic. Thank you. It's an amazing overview framework. I'm going to just jump into one idea, which I've been exploring recently, which is the role of matriarchies. And in the prophet's life, obviously his wife was extremely important too. I mean, wow. I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I view it as a partnership. It was a model partnership. So where do you see, and you do see that matriarchal societies tend to have more holistic relationship with earth and nature. And there is this beautiful gentleness in the way you speak, in all these gentleness and yet demand of excellence in a way in the underlying Islamic framework. Do you see, where is the role of the feminine or the matriarch in that?
That's a brilliant question. I've thought about this so much because one of the societies that's impressed me the most was the Iroquois Confederacy.
Right.
And one of the ways that actually the story of the peacemaker, when he comes across in a stone canoe across the lake, the five nations were warring and fighting incessantly. And you could only imagine, if Mel Gibson did the movie or what it would look like. And just violence and carnage. And the peacemaker came. When he came, he actually came first to an inn where there was no fighting, and his first partner was a woman, was the innkeeper, and she said, "I believe in your mission." And because she was important strategically, because everybody would come to that particular inn and would agree to leave their arms and their weapons at the door. So I think that's a really instructive beginning of that story, of that peacemaker story. And then their introduction to the communities and to the places where they had to win over people's hearts. They basically had to make negotiation. When they finally came to the chief of the Onondaga, he was this snake-haired, fiery, scary, living in the swamp. And he came out of the swamp and ready to do damage. But what they used were the grandmothers and the children singing songs. And in Islam, we think about this thousands of prophets. And we know stories of some of them, but we don't know the stories of all of them. And I've always thought that the story of the peacemaker was one of those prophetic stories. And that it just re-emphasizes that there may have been other ways and other traditions on how to organize and structure societies. And the way that they did that was that, yes, they had everyone had certain roles and they did certain things, but one of the core pieces that they had was a council of grandmothers. And these grandmothers were the ones that, when the hotheads like me, maybe in my younger self, or me, or the people that are storming the Capitol yesterday, when the hotheads want to go to war, they would have to go and get the permission of the grandmothers.
Right.
And he had to go. Some of these grandmothers are tough, and they're ready to fight at the drop of the hat. A lot of us know their mothers or grandmothers that would say, if you got into a fight, they ask who swung first, and if they hit you first, who finished the fight. That's kind of, there's sometimes when you might need to fight, but there's many times when we don't need to fight. And there's many times when we don't need to destroy things. And I think that if we had a very diverse, if we incorporated that, because the US Constitution was based on the Iroquois Confederacy, if we incorporated that into our actual governance structure, it might be stronger and be able to withstand some of these pressures that we have.
So I don't know if you know about the Three Fires, which was the Confederacy of the Three Fires, which was basically in the Detroit area, the Michigan area, Ohio. And I think in some ways the Iroquois Confederacy was based on it, and the Three Fires Council. And in that one, the women controlled, it was matriarchal society, and the women, just as you described with the grandmothers, the women really ran the tribes. All the meetings the men went to with all their feathers and their posturing and their dancing and all that stuff, right? And all that stuff. But they went with the instructions of the woman. And they couldn't, so and you travel like a week or whatever to go to this place where the council was, and then you couldn't change the orders. So, and that's the Three Fires is what this council then gave birth.
I don't think we have anything that prevents us intrinsically from actually doing something like that. And I think that that's something that, the Muslim world, and as well as and also governments that we have here, should really think about it.
Right. Okay, so let's get into some of these principles. So the first one I'm really intrigued in is this idea that God created everything. So I am looking for a word, and hopefully you're going to give it to me, and maybe you did give it to me, that integrates humans and nature. So I hate saying humans and nature because that makes it sound separate.
Yeah.
If you say life, that doesn't include the geology. So what's the word that means it all?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know. I'm not going to say that I had the answer to that word. I think that in Islam, there's a division sort of, there's a hadith, one of those sayings that I was mentioning earlier, that says Muslims are partners in three things: vegetation, water, and fire. And part of so we're partners in vegetation, water, and fire. And also within the context of land is divided up into developed lands and undeveloped lands.
Right.
And developed basically means, you think of a context of, I'll just quickly jump to that End of the Myth book, Grandin's book, where he looked at, he said that basically part of the American myth was that you could never exhaust the supply of land. So that if there was any kind of problem at any point, any kind of social issue, you just said, well, go west or go, we'll give you land. That'll be the deal. You can have more space to do whatever the heck you want.
Right.
And most of the American story, there was very much just rank lawlessness in that sense, and you could go out. And that's the way a lot of the world existed. Like a lot of the Turkic tribes that came down from the steppe, the Mongolians, they would go and they would travel and they would migrate, and their herds would have a place to graze, and that's kind of how we existed on the planet Earth. And you, as a human being, could go to land, and we would share these places for grazing. That was the idea of vegetation. You would share places maybe if there would need to be settlements where you would dig a well, and that was understood. You couldn't tell someone they couldn't have water from your well. And you couldn't tell someone that they couldn't let their animals graze in a place where there was a place to be grazing.
Right.
But in that context is that you would set aside what we call himma, space where it's undeveloped, and that we maintain it as such. And part of that maintenance means that part of it you leave wild, totally wild. And partially that is because there are plants and that we gain so much from plants. We have food, we have fuel, we have shelter, we also have medicine. And part of the idea was that you leave some space free and wild because you don't know what the bounty of the creator is going to provide for you in those spaces. And that you need a space for animals to be free to live. There's a space even where you could say, you can hunt in this space, just like what we do now. We say there's hunting season. But then there's also space where you can't hunt.
Right.
You shouldn't hunt.
Right.
I think that's sort of in an Islamic context, is that there's a space for everything. And that humans can use those things properly, but we have to create that division. You can't say, like we're doing now, it's okay to go into Alaska and drill for oil, or to create leases to do that, and to have the government allow that is sort of absurd, right? That's like completely absurd. Even Saddam Hussein provided clean water for the people who lived in Iraq at the time, because that was just built into the psyche of those places.
So, what's interesting is the Garrison Institute's Pathway to Planetary Health program says there are 4 things that I'm going to slowly reveal them that we need to do. And number 1 is what E.O. Wilson calls half Earth, which you just called Hima, which is to set aside, and he says it's set aside at least half the world's biodiversity, very critical areas for nature. But it's not just for nature in itself, because as you said, these are places of medicine. So these are places that actually heal us too.
I think that there's a strong argument for using the concept of himma specifically for that purpose, to create, like, we talked about, like, saving what's left, like not developing on lands, and then also healing scarred land.
Yep.
Many of the places in the Muslim world have been ripped apart by war, and also migration has also destroyed many places. You have places like the border between Syria and Turkey that are heavily traveled and very, just bombed out. And those are places that are very fertile, and they could be producing lots for lots of people. Those are the conversations that we need to have. We've set aside, we've made agreements. We're such at base level, it seems like, as humans, that we can make agreements about not using certain types of chemicals in war, right? Like, we can use them at other times, but we're not supposed to use them in war. The fact that those technologies even exist is absurd to me, but we can decide not to use them, but we can't decide which areas are just going to be set aside as safe spaces. This idea of migration also intrigues me with this, because if you're considering leaving a city because of climate change, sea level rise happening in a place, and you need a mass migration of people that's going to be going to a certain place, is it going to be absolute bedlam, or do we need to set aside certain areas that are designed to be able to capture people and hold people and feed people and give water to people? And that's about this as well. You don't want everyone to say, okay, everyone can come to my house. But if I have a home and I'm just in a safe area, I want to be able to safely provide water, safely provide a bathroom, so that people can have dignity. And I think that that's the other layer of it too. You shouldn't have places like in San Francisco where homelessness is rampant and people are defecating in the streets.
Right.
That's not how we should treat human beings.
I agree. I actually believe that we as a developed nation have a moral responsibility to house every single person.
Every person.
So interesting about migration, because you know, that in essence, India has built a wall between it and Bangladesh, and that Bangladesh, I believe the average elevation is 6 feet.
Yeah.
And that, so when sea level rises, 100 million people will be under the water, and they have to go somewhere. And their path of migration. So, you know, what's interesting about this is this actually goes to the universality of creation, which is that when we pollute water and land with toxins, it's very local. But when we pollute in the atmosphere, it's global.
Yeah.
And that, you know, you really, I mean, you know, in the end, yes, you can say this carbon dioxide came from me and that methane came from you, but
Yeah.
it's screwing us all.
Yeah.
That, you know, the atmosphere, we are so all in it together. So, you know, you can't arbitrarily divide the sky up into with borders, but we have divided the land up into borders. And what you're saying is that in the past we migrated. And by the way, it's the great migration. There was a great migration that brought peoples into the Americas 15 and 30,000 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've constructed a world where we're going to hit those walls.
I'm astonished that the idea of, I mean, I think all walls should come down in that sense. If you're keeping people, my fundamental framework for things like this is, are you destroying? Because whenever you do that, you're always destroying or preventing natural things from connecting.
Yeah.
Right. Like, there's agreements between Georgia and Alabama and South Carolina and around and Florida around water management, because
Right.
they have one source of water, or they have very limited sources of water, and they have to share some of them. And in some instances, you have to let areas that are going to overflow so that
Right.
the fish and whatnot can thrive downstream. And that happens between New York and Connecticut as well, and New Jersey. None of these borders, to me, they're extremely arbitrary, and they're not based on how human beings need to live to thrive. So anything that's been carved up based on racial barriers or national notions or ideas of nationalism, which are mainly just stories, or ideas of like religion, or any of these divisions or barriers, are really things that are dividing us from actually collectively providing for each other, right? They're not uniting us, and we can use them as tools to unite us, or we can allow them to be things to divide us. And I think right now we've been in this hyper moment of allowing things to divide us and say, well, I
Right.
can't be with them, I can't be in that way.
Right.
And but just the I was just thinking about, so that just really sticks to me, is that we've created ways to justify harming ourselves. We didn't even realize it. On the flip side of what you were saying, though, we know the sources of a lot of these pollutants.
Right.
So, you know, we have a program in the United States called the Superfund that then designates that there are responsible parties that have to clean up certain things that they've done. Like, let's Gowanus Canal, for example, is a classic one, where there's responsible parties that are the grandchildren of the gas companies that originally used manufactured gas to poison that entire area. Well, across the globe, we know those people. If you've inherited from and make money from, in this day and age, from that legacy of pollution, you are responsible, and you should be held responsible. So I think we can use that money essentially to reinvest in other things that won't do that same type of pollution. At the same time, turning that off. That sounds a lot easier than it should be, but it's not like rocket science. We do know who the culprits are.
Yes. You know, there's an interesting thing that's never been done, which is in fracking, you can actually put a billionth of a particle signature, like a chemical signature, in the fracking water. So that, and then I think you can say to people, sure, if you want to frack, but if you turns out that you've disrupted somebody's hydraulic system, screwed up their groundwater, screwed up this, screwed up that, well, no, it's you, and you have to post a bond for all those liabilities. And I bet you, if people, I bet you said to fracking companies, you have to trace all of your fluids and be completely responsible for the consequences. you'd see a whole lot less
It
fracking.
wouldn't even make sense. We would get very quickly. We would quickly get very our ingenuity hat would come on very quickly.
So this actually, to me, takes us to the idea of balance and justice.
Yeah.
So one of the things in justice that I'm just, that's coming out of this fracking example is actually taking responsibility. And you were just talking about the legacy of pollution. So it seems to me that this justice requires accountability. I want to trace this all the way through. So I want to go back to you said, so you were given the truth before you were born.
Mm.
It is in the DNA of your soul to know what is right. And so I want you to take that idea through and then talk about environmental justice. And
there was one interesting story that I always remember. That I forget which tradition. I think this is like a mixture of like the Muslim and the Jewish traditions, but it was that God created the shell of man, sort of like the form of Adam, and before breathing life into Adam and animating this form, this mud form, the shaitan, or the devil, Iblis, goes into him and circles around, and it's empty. It's empty. And he comes back out and he knocks on, and he's like, oh, it's hollow and empty. And that he said, oh, then now if I ever have to fight this being, I'll use that against it. And so I think that idea comes forward somewhat. And then there's an ayah in the Quran that says that man is lost except those that seek truth, right? So like that we come to this, yes, we come with that information, but we come to this with a sense of emptiness. And we're already coming here with a sense of like that we're a little bit lost and we're a little bit wayward. So it's almost like our soul knows it almost does not belong here in a way. It feels uncomfortable in this body. We don't necessarily know how to express that. And the way that we lean towards make things that make it seem easier to us in some ways. We lean towards ways that make us feel better in some ways, or make us feel like we've won or achieved something. I think we have a tendency in that sense to think about ourselves first above others, right? We have a tendency sometimes to say, well, if I'm okay, then everything's okay. Yesterday, while the Capitol was being stormed, I was at the armory doing track practice. My kids were just playing, running around and doing track. Everything was very calm and peaceful and lovely and wonderful in there. And if it's calm and peaceful and wonderful in our space, then we're not really aware of that. So that's sort of the interesting context that we're in.
You've just frozen. I don't think I've frozen. So everybody, Ibrahim has frozen and signed off, and my sense is he'll be signing right back on and will be unfrozen when he comes back. So just one of those internet issues that happens. So what, I encourage you to give us some more questions. We have one question for Ibrahim when he returns, which is, how does his work intersect with rematriation, which I love. By the way, in my previous conversation with Ibrahim, he told me that there's a global movement of permaculture happening in the Islamic world, which I hopefully when he comes back, we can hear more about too. And I hope he's okay, and I hope it's just an internet issue. The other thing, by the way, just you're back. Good.
I don't know what happened. Sorry about that.
Don't worry. You froze in the middle. You were there at the track with your children, and everything was cool, and you were observing the contrast between that and what was going on in the outside world.
Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Anyway, if you can pick up there, we can go on to something else if you want.
Oh yeah. So basically I was just saying that it was that the connection between where people live and their relationship and their proximity to pollution and toxicity, and their understanding of its impact on their lives. Like, for example, in some places in South Carolina, there are families and whole communities that are not connected to any sewage systems. So their sewage discharges into a pit or a hole in the backyard that sometimes they walk in. And because people haven't, so if you don't understand that that's a reality for some people and you're not connected to it, then you're going to be in your bubble and think it's okay
Right.
with me. It's all fine. Everything is fine. And that to me is astonishing what we've done in this country. We've created a society that is so well off and so has solved some of the most persistent human problems so efficiently that we can't even fathom how it may not be happening for other people. And then we dismiss that. And so bringing justice just returns the balance to that conversation. You know, the environmental justice movement started as the environmental movements against environmental racism, which I think is beautiful. That while I'm not a super big supporter of Biden, I am a big supporter of Michael Regan, who is now the new EPA administrator. Right. And he comes out of a tradition, out of a community, an ecosystem where the environmental justice community was created in North Carolina to fight against environmental racism from the Black church. And he is my age, and he comes out of, he doesn't, I don't know, directly come out of that context, but 100% that ecosystem existed for him to thrive and think that this is a path. And I think out of all the things that have come about this shift in government, that we're going to have, God willing, without people storming the Capitol, is just this idea of competence and rational thinking when it comes to how we manage natural resources. That's fundamentally what we need. We need to renegotiate our relationship with the earth, like Winona LaDuke said in 2000.
So speaking of Winona LaDuke, a question is, how does your work intersect with rematriation?
Rematriation. Explain that.
So the person who asked that, so I just presume matriarchy, bringing back of the matriarchy.
That would be beautiful. Well, that's a great thought. I mean, I'll say that I think we need to sort of, in this particular moment, look for examples and opportunities for leadership to come from women leaders. Not only that, men who are eager to run for office or eager to take on positions, who want it, should examine why they want it or why they're looking for that. There's this old saying that men run for office to make a name for themselves, and women run for office to get things done. I think right now we need to examine that. And I think particularly thinking about like even the New York City mayoral election, people should be thinking about questions of not what their story is or what their values are even that they say, but more like, do they actually understand how to make things happen, how to move things forward? And more than often, you're going to look at the candidates in this election, and the most, you're going to see really competent, amazing women that have been making things happen, that maybe we need to give them a chance to make things happen at the highest level.
Right. So the person who's asked this question has sent us a Google definition, which I'm downloading right now.
Sweet.
Rematriation of women-centered feminist indigenous knowledge. How wonderful. I'm going to see if I can post this. You know what? Here's what I'm going to do. Monique, can you see that in the questions? It'd be great if you can share that with everybody. I want to go to another thing that you had talked about, which is permaculture.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you had said that there's a global movement of permaculture in the Muslim world.
Hmm. There's a brother named Ramis Kent, Rhamis, and his last name is Kent. He's actually from Long Island, and he lives abroad now, but he has been part of this network of folks between the UK and Europe, Malaysia, Yemen, Jordan, that have been going into the natural and into wild spaces, into spaces in the Muslim world, and really teaching folks how to make land viable again. That sort of healing scarred land is actually happening. It's not just a conversation. A couple of years ago, I spoke at the Islamic Development Bank and presented that Muslim countries need, at the ministerial level, people focused on healing scarred land. That should be you should be shifting money out of the budgets of the Egypt military budget and other things like that, and just focusing on healing land. And I think that's a big part of the conversation. Like, what are we focusing on? All these bombs, all these guns, every wall we've ever built throughout all history, and this little virus comes in and knocks everybody out, right? Everything we've ever done is useless compared to this tiny little thing. So maybe that's a message. Maybe we should be reorienting our energy and our resources to think through how can we time to heal the earth and heal the land in a way that's going to help make sure that we can all live here safely and enjoy it, and also have something to do. It's not, there's a lot of people that are out here with nothing to do at all.
Exactly. By the way, I say that when the automation is coming and artificial intelligence, and there'll be a loss of many kinds of jobs, but there's one universal job, and it's the job of care, and particularly the job of healing humans and healing nature, and those scarred earth and the scarred people that have also come out of this.
Yeah.
If the society and the economy and everything was just completely focused on that I think would be a great future for us.
Right.
So another question says, how can we shift the use of religion as a divisive tool to a tool for partnering across beliefs?
That's great. I mean, I love that question. I think it's always, a lot of times interfaith work comes in a package of debate around the nature of God. And I think we should sort of get over that and not really have that debate. We're not going to solve that. You're not going to convert someone. The only way you're going to sort of convert someone is if you set a really great example of your faith and your tradition and your path. My uncle, who has been a practicing meditating Hindu for many years, he tells me, he teaches me some certain practices, but I know that when I lived with him in Oakland for a little while, and I know that when I've stayed with him, every day I see him, he meditates. Right. So that consistency is probably the most valuable thing. And I think we need to create spaces where we're actually physically working together, right? The effort that it's going to take to execute the Green New Deal at the scale that we need to do, where we're going to be retrofitting buildings, where we're going to be transforming our relationship to water and water resources and water capture, where we're going to be, rethinking, energy and sort of how we centralize systems versus localized systems. That's going to require a lot of innovation, a lot of thinking, a lot of coordination. And I think the faith community can be safe spaces for that conversation, and being actively involved. So instead of just giving someone a path as you're going to go this path and become a monk or a sheikh or a scholar in some particular way, that maybe your religious training gives you a baseline, and then you go into some of these other things around water and land and management that help add that to that conversation. That's essentially what Zaytuna College is doing out in California, where they're giving them a liberal arts education with an Islamic context, and then encouraging students to go on and jump into different fields so that they're valuable and useful in society.
That's wonderful. David Adage, the architect, just designed a campus, I think in Africa, that was designed, or maybe it was in the Middle East, for the 3 Islamic faiths. And the campus has a central square, and then it has a Jewish temple, an Islamic temple, and a Christian church. There's 3 separate buildings. And my question was, why not one building? So so just to further with this question, if if you were to design one building, one sanctuary, one temple for all three of those faiths, or maybe for all faiths, what would be the elements of it?
That is a beautiful question. I think the core question would be, hold on. I think the best part of it would be an open space.
Yeah.
Wide open space. Obviously with climate conditions
Right.
notwithstanding, I would think it'd be great to have an open roof or some kind of roof that is open to the sky.
Right.
And like bathrooms and services that were easily accessible by anyone of any ability, and comfortable and clean. So designed to sort of take water away and reuse water to the extent that that can be done. I mean, if you look at some of these places in Istanbul, some of the old mosques that were used to be churches, I think that really is the essence of that. That's what that is really. It's that kind of space. But I think the openness is important, and you have to have greenery. You have to have things growing. You have to have water flowing. It has to feel safe.
Fantastic. Second, make it a note.
Oh, okay. The other thing, a part of the Living Future Institute is the composting toilets, because that's one of my favorite things. I think we have to figure out how to not use clean water for human waste.
Got it.
Right, and then that's one of my pet peeves. It's like, 100 years from now, we're going to look back on us and think these people were crazy. How could they have done that?
Exactly. So one last question. What are the unique and particular contributions of African American Muslims? Have been being raised as a Black Muslim and just contributed to a book of essays by African American Buddhists. I didn't know you did that. Wonderful. It's called Black and Buddhist, and it's published by Shambhala. I'm curious about your perspective on Black Americans and our complex and diverse spiritualities that relates to environmental justice. And I'm going to tell you the name of the questioner because I have a suspicion you know, Camila Majid.
Oh, mashallah, that's great. Okay, so there's two sisters, Sarah Yasmin Latif and Sister Corey Majid, and they just put together I had referenced it earlier, the 40 hadith, which are the 40 green hadith.
Right.
And they are really representative of that question. I think that there's a growing Black Muslim women that are really anchoring the environmental movement, younger women, Black Muslim women that have really been pushing this conversation in a way that, and particularly this 40 green hadith is really a powerful tool. It's an incredible tool. They have like questions, really probing questions at the end of it to make you reflect on the selections. But I think you're going to start to see a lot more production come out from the thought perspective. And then I've seen more and more Muslim women that are joining the ranks of architecture, and that it's a viable field, and seeing that as a real pathway. And I think that you're going to start to see that manifest and change some of the built environment as those numbers go up. I think that's going to be a big part of that change.
Wow. So tell me more about Muslim women as architects. Where are you?
Yeah, I mean, I know of at least 3 or 4 Muslim women that and I could share with you also, but just really, really thinking really carefully about their role as Muslims in their work, right? Just really considering it in every decision point that they make, where the source of their materials, where the buildings fit and situate themselves in relationship to our understanding of prayer, and of light and of shadow and those sort of things. I think that there's a really a growing group of folks. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. Obviously, the architecture profession is one of the whitest and one of the most male professions. And no disrespect to anybody who's gone through that process. We will have better buildings when we have more, just like biodiversity will mean a healthier planet. We will have better buildings when we have more diverse people designing them.
Right. Yes, yes, yes. So by the way, just to reveal another questioner, the question about how do we shift the use of religion from a divisive tool to a partnering tool came from Vivian Lofness, who's one of the great green professors of architecture in the world.
Nice. We got good people on here.
Yeah. So our time has come to an end. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really, really appreciate it. It's been so wonderful to have you on it. And I hope that uh, for those who listened, you learned something. I certainly learned a lot of things. So thank you all for joining us today. The Planetary Pathway to Planetary Health Forums are offered free of charge. So if you'd like to support our programming, please consider making a donation to the Garrison Institute or sponsoring another conversation. Our next conversation will be a week from today on Thursday, January 14th at 2 p.m. with Joanna Macy. Joanna is a scholar of Buddhism and systems thinking and deep ecology. She's a teacher in a program she calls The Work That Reconnects. We hope you can join us again soon, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is really awesome. I think you're an easy person to talk to, Jonathan. I think you have a way with the calm way, the calm demeanor. So I appreciate you and all the effort and all the folks that Michael and Monique and Megan, and blessings to everybody. I just want to also just take a moment to say that a lot of people, we've lost a lot of people this year. There was a gentleman named Cecil Corbin Mark, who was one of the leaders of the environmental movement in New York State, and one of my mentors, my friend Darren Simon, who was a Washington Post reporter who I went to college with. My sister passed away as well. So all of the people that we have lost, my friend lost his brother and his sister-in-law just a few weeks ago. So just acknowledge them and bring them with us. You know, let's not get stuck in the past, but let's bring their energy and their spirit to make the work that we do a lot more productive and a lot more focused.
That's beautiful. Yes, thank you. And just Monique, if you can get from Camila, so one of our participants asked to contact you, so we'll connect you and that person. Monique, if you can help do that, that'd be great.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you, Jonathan.
So much.
It's a pleasure.
Peace be with you.
You too as well.